There is a side of narcissistic behavior that people rarely talk about. Most conversations about narcissism focus on obvious manipulation, the gaslighting, the love bombing, the silent treatment, the constant need for admiration, the emotional games, the endless cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard. But there is another arena where narcissistic patterns can become especially confusing and damaging: intimacy. And this is where many people become trapped in a particularly painful contradiction. Because the person who seems intensely attracted to you can simultaneously show very little genuine intimacy. They may pursue you relentlessly. They may make you feel uniquely desirable. They may tell you that nobody has ever affected them the way you do. They may make the relationship feel extraordinarily intense. And yet, beneath that intensity, something can feel strangely empty. You may eventually realize that what looked like intimacy was sometimes being used as a form of control. What looked like passion could have been validation seeking. What looked like vulnerability could have been strategic disclosure. What looked like irresistible chemistry could have been an attachment mechanism. And what looked like sexual confidence could sometimes conceal profound insecurity. Before we go further, one important distinction matters. Not every person with narcissistic traits behaves in these ways, and not every unhealthy sexual behavior means someone has narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissism exists on a spectrum, and only a qualified professional can diagnose a personality disorder. What we are examining here are behavioral patterns that can occur in relationships where entitlement, manipulation, exploitation, lack of empathy, control, and the need for validation become dominant. The purpose isn't to turn intimacy into a diagnostic checklist. The purpose is to help you recognize when something that should involve mutual trust, respect, consent, and emotional safety has instead become another battlefield for power. Because healthy intimacy requires two people, narcissistic dynamics often turn intimacy into an audience. And once you understand that distinction, some of the strangest things you experienced may suddenly begin to make sense. Number one, using intimacy as a tool for control. One of the most confusing patterns can be the way intimacy becomes connected to control. In a healthy relationship, physical affection and intimacy are not bargaining chips. They aren't rewards for obedience. They aren't punishments for disagreement. They aren't weapons used to make another person desperate for approval. But in a manipulative relationship, intimacy can become part of a larger reward and punishment system. When you agree with them, they may become affectionate. When you challenge them, they may suddenly become distant. When you give them the attention they want, warmth returns. When you establish a boundary, affection disappears. Over time, your nervous system begins learning the pattern. Approval feels connected to closeness. Disagreement feels connected to rejection. And eventually, you may find yourself changing your behavior simply to prevent emotional or physical withdrawal. This is where the dynamic becomes psychologically powerful. You aren't necessarily asking yourself, what do I actually want? Instead, you start asking, what do I need to do to get them close to me again? That is a very different question. And it can quietly transform intimacy from connection into conditioning. The narcissistic partner doesn't necessarily have to say, do what I want, or I will withdraw affection. The pattern itself communicates the message. You experience warmth when you comply. You experience coldness when you resist. Eventually, you begin regulating yourself around their reactions. You apologize faster. You suppress concerns. You avoid difficult conversations. You stop asking questions. You become careful. And perhaps the most painful part is that you may initially interpret your own behavior as love. You might tell yourself, I'm trying to keep the relationship peaceful. I'm trying to understand them. I'm trying not to trigger another argument. I'm trying to bring back the person they were in the beginning. But if intimacy consistently depends upon your obedience, it isn't functioning as mutual connection anymore. It has become part of the control system. And control does not always look aggressive. Sometimes control wears perfume. Sometimes it sends affectionate messages. Sometimes it tells you exactly what you want to hear. Sometimes it reaches for your hand after an argument. That is why manipulation can be so difficult to recognize. The behavior that keeps you attached isn't always painful. Sometimes it is precisely what feels wonderful. The intermittent return of affection can make the bond even stronger. You experience distance, you experience confusion, then suddenly they become affectionate again. Your relief can feel enormous. You may think, Finally, we're okay. But your nervous system has just received a reward after a period of uncertainty. That cycle can become extremely difficult to break. And the important question is not simply whether intimacy exists. The question is, what happens when you say no? That question reveals more about a relationship than almost anything else. If your no is respected, there is room for safety. If your no produces punishment, humiliation, intimidation, retaliation, manipulation, or coercion, there is a serious problem. Healthy intimacy can survive a boundary. Manipulation cannot. Number 2, turning sexual attention into narcissistic supply. Narcissistic dynamics are often driven by an intense need for external validation. Attention becomes evidence. Admiration becomes emotional fuel. Being desired can become a way of temporarily stabilizing a fragile sense of self, and intimacy can provide an especially powerful form of validation. Someone wants me. Someone finds me attractive. Someone is emotionally affected by me. Someone is willing to rearrange their life for me. Someone is jealous over me. Someone can't stop thinking about me. To a validation-hungry person, these experiences can become intoxicating. But there is an important difference between wanting intimacy with another person and wanting another person's desire as proof of your own worth. The first is relational, the second is self-referential. In a narcissistic dynamic, the partner can begin feeling less like a person and more like a mirror. Your attraction reflects their desirability. Your attention reflects their importance. Your jealousy reflects their power. Your emotional dependence reflects their significance. And this can explain something that confuses many people. Why would someone seem so obsessed with getting your attention but become strangely uninterested once they have it? Because sometimes the pursuit itself was the reward. The chase proves they can attract you. The conquest proves they can influence you. The emotional reaction proves they matter. Once the validation has been secured, the intensity can suddenly decline, and the person on the other side is left wondering, what changed? Maybe nothing changed about you. The function of the interaction changed. At the beginning, you were an exciting source of validation. Later, you became familiar. And familiarity can be difficult for someone who constantly needs novelty, admiration, or external confirmation. This is why some narcissistic relationships feel like being placed on a pedestal and then suddenly thrown off it. The partner wasn't necessarily being evaluated as a whole human being. They were being evaluated according to how effectively they served an emotional function. When you provided admiration, you were fascinating. When you needed support, you became demanding. When you praised them, you were special. When you criticized harmful behavior, you became negative. When you were fascinated by them, they felt connected. When you expected reciprocity, suddenly you were asking for too much. The relationship becomes centered around one person's psychological needs. And the tragedy is that the other person may spend months or years trying to recreate the beginning. They keep thinking, if I become more attractive, if I become more understanding, if I stop complaining, if I become more exciting, if I give them more attention, if I become the person they first believed I was, maybe then the affection will return. But that strategy keeps you trapped in the audition. You are constantly performing for a role you already earned. And healthy love doesn't require you to audition forever. Number 3, crossing boundaries and then making you feel guilty for having them. One of the most disturbing patterns in unhealthy relationships is boundary testing. A boundary is not an insult. It is not rejection. It is not an attack. It is information about what you are comfortable with and what you are not comfortable with. A healthy partner may feel disappointed by a boundary. They may need a conversation about it, but they ultimately recognize your right to have it. A manipulative partner may treat your boundary as a challenge, and that distinction matters enormously. They may start small. They ask for something you aren't comfortable with. You say no. They push. You repeat yourself. They become irritated. You explain. They tell you that you're being dramatic. You explain again. They accuse you of not trusting them. You begin defending yourself. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about your boundary anymore. It is about whether you are a good partner. That shift is incredibly important because now you are no longer protecting your comfort. You are defending your character. They might say, if you really loved me, you wouldn't have a problem with this. Why are you so insecure? Everyone else I've been with was fine with it. You clearly don't trust me. You're making this bigger than it is. You're being too sensitive. The objective may not even be to convince you that the behavior is acceptable. The objective can be to make you distrust your own judgment. Once that happens, resistance becomes harder. You begin thinking, maybe I am being unreasonable. Maybe this is normal. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I should just compromise. And compromise is healthy when both people freely negotiate. But surrendering a boundary because you have been emotionally pressured is something else entirely. A person who respects you does not need you to abandon your sense of safety to prove your love. That deserves repeating. You do not prove love by violating yourself. You do not prove trust by ignoring discomfort. You do not prove commitment by surrendering your right to say no. And if someone repeatedly treats your boundaries as obstacles they must overcome, pay attention to the pattern. The issue isn't simply what they want. The issue is how they respond when you don't want the same thing. Number 4, using jealousy to manufacture desire and competition. Another behavior that can appear in narcissistic relationships is deliberately creating jealousy. The person may talk about other people. They may emphasize how attractive others find them. They may compare you with previous partners. They may flirt in ways designed to be noticed. They may make comments about attention they receive, and when you react, they may accuse you of being insecure. This creates a strange psychological trap. They provoke insecurity. Then they criticize you for experiencing it. They create competition. Then they blame you for competing. They make you feel replaceable. Then they tell you that your reaction proves you're possessive. Why would someone do this? Because jealousy can function as a form of validation. If you become jealous, they receive evidence that you care. If you become anxious about losing them, they feel powerful. If you start competing for their attention, they become the prize. And suddenly the relationship isn't about two people building trust. It becomes a marketplace. Who wants them more? Who is more attractive? Who gets their attention? Who can keep them interested? Who can win? That competition can be exhausting, and the person being manipulated may become hypervigilant. You start noticing every name, every notification, every change in tone, every new follower, every unexplained absence, every compliment they give someone else, every time they seem more excited about another person than they seem about you. Your brain begins scanning for threats. You aren't experiencing intimacy anymore. You're monitoring the environment, and the more you monitor, the more emotionally invested you become. This can create an addictive loop. They trigger insecurity. You seek reassurance. They provide just enough reassurance to keep you attached. Then the insecurity returns. The cycle repeats. Healthy intimacy doesn't require constant competition. If someone needs to make you afraid of losing them in order to make you value them, that isn't emotional security. That is emotional leverage. Number 5, treating infidelity as an entitlement rather than a betrayal. Another deeply damaging pattern can involve entitlement around fidelity. The narcissistic person may believe ordinary relationship rules apply differently to them. They may demand loyalty while expecting freedom for themselves. They may react with outrage when they suspect you of being unfaithful while minimizing their own behavior. They may create elaborate explanations for their actions. It's not what you think. It didn't mean anything. You weren't giving me enough attention. We weren't technically together. I was lonely. You pushed me away. Everyone makes mistakes. Notice what happens in these explanations. Responsibility moves away from the person who made the choice. It moves toward circumstances, toward you, toward the relationship, toward alcohol, toward stress, toward temptation, toward anything except personal accountability. But betrayal is not erased by creating a complicated explanation. A mature person can make a harmful decision and still say, I chose this. I hurt you. I understand why you are devastated. I accept the consequences. A narcissistic dynamic may instead involve denial, minimization, blame shifting, counter-accusations, or outrage that you discovered the behavior. And sometimes the shocking part isn't even the betrayal itself. It's their reaction to being confronted. You may expect remorse. Instead, you receive anger. You may expect accountability. Instead, you receive accusations. You may expect honesty. Instead, the story keeps changing. This can leave you questioning reality. And that is where the damage becomes deeper than the original act. Because now you're not only grieving betrayal, you're trying to solve a mystery. You are reconstructing timelines, comparing messages, remembering conversations, questioning what you were told, wondering what else happened, wondering whether you were ever given the truth. The mind hates unresolved contradictions. It keeps returning to them. And that can keep you psychologically connected to the person long after the relationship ends. You are no longer trying to get them back. You are trying to understand what happened. Sometimes closure does not come from getting the perfect confession. Sometimes closure begins when you stop requiring the person who harmed you to provide the explanation that will heal you. Number 6. Using comparison to destroy your confidence. Comparison is another weapon that can appear in unhealthy, intimate relationships. The narcissistic partner may compare your appearance, your body, your attractiveness, your performance, your personality, your level of experience, your behavior compared with previous partners. Sometimes the comparison is subtle. You're different from my ex. Sometimes it sounds like praise. My ex never understood me like you do. That may feel flattering at first. But if comparisons become a recurring feature of the relationship, they can gradually create insecurity. You begin wondering whether you're enough physically, enough emotionally, enough romantically, enough intellectually, enough in every possible category. And once you begin measuring yourself against imaginary competitors, the narcissistic partner gains tremendous influence because now you're trying to win a competition they created. You may begin overinvesting, trying harder, giving more, ignoring your own discomfort. The relationship becomes performance-based, and performance-based intimacy has a hidden cost. You stop asking, do I feel safe with this person? You start asking, am I good enough for this person? Those are completely different questions. The first protects your well-being. The second places your worth in someone else's hands. That is precisely where manipulation becomes powerful. If another person becomes the judge of your attractiveness, your desirability, your worth, and your ability to keep them interested, then every fluctuation in their attention becomes a verdict. Warm today, you feel valuable. Cold tomorrow, you feel rejected. Interested, you feel beautiful. Distant, you feel inadequate. The narcissistic partner doesn't even need to criticize you constantly. Their inconsistency can do the work. Number 7, confusing intensity with intimacy. This may be one of the biggest traps. Intensity feels powerful. Intimacy feels safe. They are not the same thing. A relationship can move incredibly fast. Constant messages, endless conversations, declarations of extraordinary connection, rapid emotional disclosure, strong attraction, big promises, future plans. The feeling that you have finally met someone who understands you. It can feel almost cinematic, but intensity does not automatically equal depth. Sometimes intensity is simply acceleration. The relationship moves so quickly that there isn't enough time to observe consistency. You don't yet know how they behave when disappointed. You don't know how they handle boundaries. You don't know how they handle criticism. You don't know whether their promises survive inconvenience. You don't know whether their affection survives your independence. You don't know whether they can tolerate your separate identity. You only know how they behave while they are pursuing you. And pursuit can reveal very little about how someone behaves once they believe they have secured access to you. This is why the transition from idealization to devaluation can feel so psychologically brutal. The beginning was enormous. The attention was enormous. The declarations were enormous. Then suddenly, everything shrinks. And you're left wondering whether you imagined the beginning. You didn't necessarily imagine it, but you may have interpreted intensity as evidence of long-term compatibility. Those aren't the same thing. Real intimacy grows through repetition, through reliability, through difficult conversations, through boundaries, through accountability, through ordinary days, through seeing each other clearly rather than projecting fantasies onto each other. Healthy intimacy survives reality. Manipulative intensity often depends upon fantasy. Number 8, using intimacy to avoid emotional accountability. Another pattern occurs when physical closeness becomes a substitute for emotional repair. Imagine there has been a serious conflict. You have raised a legitimate concern. You want an apology. You want an explanation. You want accountability. Instead of addressing the issue, the person suddenly becomes affectionate. They want closeness. They act as though the argument never happened. You may feel confused. Part of you is relieved. The tension disappears. For a moment, everything feels good again. But the original problem remains. Nothing was actually repaired. It was covered. This can create a dangerous relationship pattern. Conflict, distance, affection, temporary relief, then the same conflict returns. Over time, you may learn that difficult conversations don't lead to solutions. They lead to temporary emotional or physical reconnection. And because reconnection feels good, you stop pursuing resolution. You think, at least we're okay now. But are you? Affection cannot replace accountability. A relationship cannot heal through romantic gestures or I love you without genuine recognition, responsibility, understanding, change behavior, and consistency. It then highlights how a manipulative partner may exploit vulnerability by learning your fears, insecurities, and emotional triggers only to later use them against you. The final section explains how repeated denial, contradictions, and manipulation can make you doubt your own reality, desirability, and judgment. Healing begins when you stop trying to prove your worth or convince the other person and instead reclaim your boundaries and self-trust. The broader message is that narcissistic relationship dynamics are ultimately about power, control, and imbalance, often appearing through small repeated behaviors rather than one dramatic event. And staying longer than expected does not mean you were stupid or wanted to be mistreated. Manipulative relationships often contain enough positive reinforcement to make leaving psychologically complicated. There may have been beautiful moments, real memories, real attraction, real laughter, real tenderness, real hope. And that's what makes these relationships so difficult. If someone were cruel every second of every day, leaving would be easier. The confusing relationship is the one where the painful moments are mixed with moments that feel extraordinary. You don't simply lose a person. Narcissistic behavior can turn intimacy into a tool for control, validation, manipulation, jealousy, boundary violations, comparison, and emotional exploitation. It emphasizes that healthy intimacy is built on consent, respect, safety, trust, and mutual boundaries, not pressure or punishment. The core message is, stop confusing intensity with intimacy, desire with devotion, or jealousy with love. Healing begins when you stop chasing, proving, competing, and abandoning yourself, and instead choose clarity, boundaries, self-respect, and genuine emotional safety. In a few words, narcissistic intimacy can become control disguised as passion, while healing means reclaiming your boundaries, self-worth, and peace.